Uranium was used as a food-safe glaze on dishes your great-grandmother ate from, not by accident, by design, by chemists with degrees who tested it and approved it. Sit with that for a second. The assumption most people carry into this story is that ignorance looked like ignorance, that the people painting radium onto clock dials were somehow obviously careless, that the danger was visible, and they chose not to see it. That assumption is wrong in a way that matters, because if the danger had been visible, this would be a simple story about recklessness. It isn't. Uranium oxide has been a pigment since before the Roman Empire. Archaeologists found it in mosaic glass at a villa near Naples, dated to 79 AD. Not trace amounts, deliberate use. Someone in the 1st century selected uranium compounds for their color, a specific saturated yellow-green that other minerals couldn't match, and used them to make something beautiful. There is no record that anyone got sick at those concentrations. In that form, the external radiation dose was likely low enough that it wouldn't have been detectable against the background noise of normal illness and mortality. They weren't lucky. The physics was genuinely different from what came later. By the 19th century, uranium oxide had a commercial name, uranium yellow. It showed up in porcelain glazes, in glass, in ceramic tiles. The Meissen factory in Germany used it. Manufacturers in England used it. Vaseline glass, named for its color similarity to petroleum jelly, was mass-produced tableware that glowed green under light, and it was sold as a premium product. People bought it because it was beautiful. Under ultraviolet light, which wasn't available to most households then, the glow is almost hallucinatory. Under ordinary daylight, it just looked like exceptional glass. No one was hiding anything. The uranium content was not a secret. It appeared in manufacturing records, in chemical catalogs, in trade publications. The question of whether it was safe essentially never came up, because nothing that anyone could observe suggested it wasn't. Then came radium, and radium is a different element with a different story, and I need to be exact about why. I discovered radium in 1898, working with my husband Pierre in a shed in Paris that was so damp the walls wept in winter. The raw material was pitchblende, uranium ore, and we were processing it in bulk, boiling down tons of it to isolate a substance I had detected in the readings but could not yet hold in my hand. The readings were what mattered first. The electrometer showed ionization levels in pitchblende that were too high for uranium alone. Something else was there. We called what we found radioactivity, and I want to be precise about what that word meant when I first used it, because it did not mean what it means now. In 1898, radioactivity meant this substance emits something, continuously, spontaneously, without any external energy input. That was the observation. That was all. The mechanism why an atom would emit radiation, what was happening inside it, what the structure of the atom even was. None of that existed. The nucleus hadn't been described. The proton hadn't been named. The neutron wouldn't be confirmed until 1932. I was measuring an output without any model of what was producing it. This is not a small distinction. It is the entire explanation for why trained scientists handled these materials the way they did. Radium-226 decays with a half-life of 1,600 years. As it decays, it releases alpha particles, helium nuclei moving fast enough to ionize whatever they pass through. Outside the body, alpha particles are stopped by a sheet of paper, by a few centimeters of air, by the dead outer layer of skin. They don't penetrate. By that metric, in the 1900s and early 1910s, radium seemed manageable. The external dose from a vial of radium in your hand is real but not immediately catastrophic. Inside the body, alpha particles are a different problem entirely. They deposit all their energy in a very short path length, 1 or 2 cell diameters. That concentrated local ionization shreds DNA. Radium, once ingested, behaves chemically like calcium. Your body cannot distinguish between them. It deposits radium into bone, into teeth, into the jaw. There it stays, emitting alpha radiation directly into the bone marrow, into the cells that produce blood, for as long as the radium remains, which at 1,600 years per half-life is functionally forever in any human timescale. Nobody knew this in 1917. The dial painters at the United States Radium Corporation were hired to paint luminous numbers onto watch faces and military instrument dials. The paint was a mixture of radium salts, zinc sulfide as a phosphor, and a water-based adhesive. The brushes were fine-tipped. To maintain the tip's precision, workers were told to point the brush with their lips. Some workers later reported being told the paint was safe, that the radium would put color in their cheeks, make them healthy. Whether that instruction came from genuine belief or from something else is a question I'll come back to. The workers lip-pointed hundreds of times per day. Some painted their nails with the material at the end of shifts, as a joke, because the glow was pretty. Some painted their teeth. They walked home glowing in the dark. Grace Fryer started work at the factory in 1917. By the early 1920s, her jaw had begun to deteriorate. Teeth loosened, bone infections that didn't respond to treatment. Her dentist found that her jaw had become riddled with holes, not from decay, but from something the medical literature had no name for yet. Amelia Maja died in 1922. Her death certificate said syphilis. She had never had syphilis. The syphilis diagnosis was convenient because syphilis was stigmatizing and because syphilis explained away the jaw destruction without implicating the factory. Several other workers received the same diagnosis. The same doctor made several of them. Irene Rudolph, Ella Eckert, Hazel Vincent Kuzer, Josephine Smith. The pattern was visible to anyone looking at a factory employment roster alongside hospital admissions in Orange, New Jersey. The cluster was there. It required someone to look for it. A Harvard professor named Cecil Drinker was hired by the company in 1924 to conduct a health survey of workers. His team found severe anemia, bone damage, and what appeared to be systemic radium poisoning. He wrote a report. The company's medical officer, Frederick Flynn, subsequently published his own report, concluding that the workers were essentially healthy. Drinker later obtained a copy of a company document that had reproduced his findings with alterations, his data rewritten to reach the opposite conclusion. Drinker went public. The company sued him and lost. I said I'd come back to whether the lip-pointing instruction came from genuine belief or something else. Here is what the documents show. By 1924, at least one company official knew that radium deposited in bone and that bone deposition was harmful. The instruction to lip point continued. Workers who asked about safety were told there was no danger. That is a different category of event from scientific ignorance. Both things were happening at once. Genuine scientific uncertainty in the broader research community and specific institutional suppression inside one company. The story requires holding both. My own situation was scientific uncertainty without suppression, and it still killed me. I carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in my coat pockets in the laboratory, because the coat had deep pockets and the tubes fit in them, and I was moving between equipment constantly. I stored radium samples in my desk drawer. The laboratory in Paris was never well ventilated. We couldn't afford to build it properly, and the university was not particularly interested in funding a woman's research at the scale it deserved. I breathed radon, a decay product of radium, for years in that space without knowing radon was there, or that it was ionizing my lung tissue every time I inhaled. I knew the rays were producing some effect on skin. Pierre and I had both noticed redness and irritation after prolonged contact with concentrated samples, and Pierre had conducted deliberate experiments on his own arm, burning it intentionally to document the effect. We wrote about this. We noted it as a potentially useful medical property. The ability to destroy tissue could destroy tumors. We did not interpret it as evidence that the rays were also damaging us in ways we couldn't see. My fingertips were chronically raw. The skin wouldn't heal properly at the contact points. I assumed it was the lab chemicals. There were many chemicals in the laboratory that could cause dermatitis. I didn't investigate whether the radium specifically was responsible, because I had no framework that would have led me to look. The biological mechanism, ionizing radiation damaging DNA, the stochastic nature of that damage, the delay between exposure and consequence, did not exist as a scientific framework. You cannot look for something that your conceptual vocabulary cannot describe. I developed aplastic anemia. My bone marrow stopped producing sufficient blood cells. The doctors who treated me toward the end of my life believed it was caused by radiation. I was not entirely convinced. Not because I was defensive about my work, but because the causal chain, decades of low-level exposure leading to bone marrow failure, was not something medicine had established with the rigor I required to accept it. I was a scientist. I wanted the mechanism demonstrated, not inferred from correlation. The mechanism was demonstrated after my death, in animal studies, in the 1920s and 1930s, in epidemiological work on the dial painters, whose legal battles forced the collection of data that would otherwise never have existed, in cellular biology studies through the 1940s, in the dosimetry work that came from studying Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, the linear no-threshold model, the framework that says ionizing radiation carries risk at any dose, with no minimum threshold below which the risk disappears, was formally adopted by major health bodies in the 1950s. It is still contested at the very low dose end. There are researchers who argue that at doses below roughly 100 millisieverts, the body's DNA repair mechanisms may be sufficient to eliminate the excess cancer risk. There are researchers who argue the data support the linear model down to the lowest measurable doses. The argument is genuine and technical and ongoing, and if anyone tells you it's settled, they're simplifying. What is not contested, the doses experienced by the dial painters were not low. Estimates for the most heavily exposed workers run into the thousands of millisieverts deposited directly in bone. The biological outcome was not ambiguous. Grace Fryer filed suit in 1927. She and 4 other workers, the case became known as the Radium Girls, sued the United States Radium Corporation for damages. The company's lawyers attempted to have the case dismissed on a statute of limitations argument. Too much time had passed since the original exposure. The workers' lawyers argued that the clock on the statute of limitations should start from when the harm was discoverable, not from when the exposure occurred. That argument made by dying women in a New Jersey courtroom, created legal precedent that still governs occupational exposure cases. The settlement came in 1928. Each of the 5 women received $10,000, a $600 annual pension for as long as they lived, and medical expenses. Grace Fryer was so physically deteriorated by the time the settlement was reached that she had to be carried into the courtroom. She was 27. The radium dial clock is an object that still exists. Antique dealers have them. Museums have them. Some are still mildly radioactive, enough that you'd want to handle them carefully, not enough to cause harm from brief contact. Under UV light, the paint on the dials glows green, same green as the uranium glass dishes, same green as the Vaseline glass tumblers. The glow has not changed. What has changed is the equipment we hold up next to it. The Geiger counters, the dosimetry badges, the cellular biology that can trace a specific type of DNA damage to a specific type of radiation, the epidemiological methods that can detect a signal inside the statistical noise of human mortality. We built those instruments out of this, out of the specific suffering of specific people, out of lawsuits that should never have needed to be filed, out of animal studies done in the 1920s on animals that did not choose to participate, out of my notebooks that you still cannot touch. The notebooks sit in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in lead-lined boxes. Researchers who want to consult them sign a liability waiver, acknowledging the radiation risk. They put on protective equipment. They open the boxes. My handwriting is still in there. The measurements I made in 1898 and 1899 and 1900, the columns of numbers, the corrections in the margins, still readable, still precise, still hot.